I don't know if Trump mentioned it, but Powell himself did not discuss the current pace of interest rate cuts or when that'll happen or kind of a prediction on that.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by economics reporter Zach Halaschak, the man who puts silly in reconciliation.
That's right.
So now the reconciliation bill, the big beautiful bill, is working its way to the Senate. You've got some of the same divisions among Senate Republicans that existed with House Republicans. Are there some changes expected? What can we be looking forward to?
It really depends on who you ask, and that's what it comes down to now. Right now we're on recess. We had about 2 weeks of just nonstop reconciliation in the House where they were amending, making changes in all the various committees. I closely followed the Ways and Means, which is where the tax provisions came from, and that's kind of the biggest part of this one big beautiful bill. So now it's going to go to the Senate, and I would say there was kind of three factions in the House. That you had the SALT people who wanted a bigger SALT cap, the state and local tax deduction. You had the kind of fiscal hawks who wanted lower deficit spending, less spending cuts to things like Medicaid and SNAP or food stamps, and then you had the moderates who were kind of pushing back on the deficit hawks and saying, we don't want these big cuts to Medicaid. We have districts where they have a high proportion of people getting these, and that would not be good politically for us or for the people in your district.
Right.
I think in the Senate you're not going to really have much about SALT. So that's
Right.
that was probably the biggest wedge issue among that group.
No real senators from
No.
high tax blue states. I mean, you've
Yeah.
got Susan Collins, but that's not really
No.
one of the higher tax blue states.
It's really Republicans who are in states with high taxes, and there's not any of that in the Senate. So you're not going to see people really pushing to make change that. Now there could be some people kind of push the other way, say, oh, they've raised the cap too high. It's, I think, $40,000 with a $500,000 income cap right now. They might be trying to rein that in. I don't think that's very likely, though, just because of how difficult it was to even get to that number.
Right.
And the Senate knows that, this is going to have to come back to the House for another vote, and they got to pass this. They can't drag this out until next year because all of it expires at the end of the year.
Right.
So anyway, the SALT, I think you're going to see more of an issue with the deficit hawks in the Senate trying to cut more spending. Ron Johnson frequently says that he hates the reconciliation bill the way it is now, and he wants to, pare back spending even more. But then I was talking to Jason Smith on the phone the other day, who's the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and he told me he thinks that 95% of the bill will remain the same, which seems exceedingly optimistic given some of the comments from lawmakers over on the Senate side of things. But it's just going to be interesting to see how it shakes out in these committees. And the Senate, the way it kind of goes is organizationally different than the House and how they do things. So this could be a long process.
If they do some cuts elsewhere, say if they have a rescissions bill, which is now expected, does that alleviate any of the pressure on the one big beautiful bill, or they're still going to be pressing for more savings?
So I think that it'll probably help, but I think you're going to have some lawmakers, especially like Ron Johnson and Rand Paul, who are going to be pushing for bigger and bigger cuts. Now that's challenging because then you have other lawmakers, especially in the House, who are don't want these big cuts and might refuse to vote for it if they cut too much. So it's going to be about this kind of balancing act between not only the cuts versus the Medicaid and then the cuts, but also between the House and the Senate and what each chamber can get passed and kind of coming together to make a package that will get final approval in the House and the Senate and then go to President Trump's desk.
And of course, the big thing that everybody wants to avoid would be an across-the-board tax increase once the Trump tax cuts expire. So that does apply some pressure to everybody involved.
I mean, a lot of pressure, right? Democrats like to brand this as a giveaway to the wealthy, but a majority of Americans would see their taxes go up unless something is done, unless a piece of legislation is passed to continue these tax cuts that were originally lowered back in 2017. So the political optics of Republicans not being able to, when they control both chambers of Congress and the presidency, get a bill across and passed, it would be, terrible, especially in a midterm year next year where you have all these people up for re-election. It would not be good politically for them.
So President Trump hasn't always been the biggest fan of Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, although
say the least.
he did appoint him. they've conversed recently. What was the subject of the meeting, and how did that seem to go?
Yeah, it kind of came as a surprise. We got a readout from the Federal Reserve today, and they said that President Trump met with Fed Chairman Jerome Powell. I don't think it was a meeting that was called by the Fed chair. It was probably called by the president, because I know Powell's been asked about this at press conferences. Are you going to meet with them? And he said, I've always met with any president who calls me into their office. It's going to go the same way with Trump. So it would have been called presumably by President Trump. We don't really know too much about what they discussed. It was kept, pretty small, the amount of details were given by the Fed. But basically, they just talked about the economy, inflation, and it was noted in there that one thing that wasn't discussed is where Powell expects monetary policy to go in the coming weeks and months. So, Trump has been trying to pressure the Fed, and other Trump administration officials have been trying to lower interest rates, saying interest rates are too high, it's stifling investment, it's slowing the economy, it's slowing economic growth. So he's been trying to get, which most presidents always love to see lower interest rates because it spurs growth, but he's kind of been pushing for that on social media. And then you have people like Bill Pulte, who's at FHSA, pushing for lower rates, and those don't seem to be discussed. I don't know if Trump mentioned it, but Powell himself did not discuss the current pace of interest rate cuts or when that'll happen, or kind of a prediction on that.
Have to look and see what the inflation numbers are,
That's right.
see if there might be a rate cut in the offing.
Get a new one soon.
Yep. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks.
You can read Zach and the rest of our policy team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.